meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll just wait for a couple of seconds as everyone logs in. Brilliant. Well, thank you all very, very much for joining us for what is an unexpectedly topical discussion. So to set the background, we're joined today by Sir Michael Barber, who's chairing the Police Foundation's independent strategic review of policing in the UK, which I think is the first such exercise for many years. Lisa Townsend, who's Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, and of course the Right Honourable Kit Malthouse, who is the Policing Minister and was responsible for these issues while working under Boris Johnson in London. So we then have a the independent review is being launched in a couple of weeks' time. So the plan for this meeting was for Sir Michael to preview its contents and for Kit to respond. But then obviously last week we had a quite extraordinary event when the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was dismissed from her role by the Mayor of London, or effectively by the Mayor of London, which has brought these issues of policing completely to the forefront of the agenda. So I'm really pleased to be hosting this discussion. I'm really pleased that you can all join us. And please do ask your questions in the Q&A, or if you're watching us on YouTube or on Twitter or Facebook or any other platform, if you put your questions in the comments, our team should be able to see them and pass them on to me. So with that, I'll introduce Sir Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for hosting this at the Centre for Policy Studies, and thanks to all your colleagues for setting it up. It's also a pleasure to work with Lisa and Kit on this discussion, which I think, as you rightly say, Robert, is very topical. The Independent Strategic Review was originally launched more than a couple of years ago, and we've been working away in the background, and we're going to launch our report on the 8th of March. And it's great to have this conversation ahead of that about the challenges facing policing. The Police Foundation has hosted the report. It's a think tank that has worked on policing issues for a number of years and does some fantastic work. And it's been a pleasure for me to work with them. So we're going to have a very substantial report, as you said, Robert, one probably more substantial than anything that's been done for decades. It'll have the final report will have over 250 pages and 50 plus recommendations. Before I get into the challenges facing policing, I do want to say one thing, though. There are many thousands of police officers across this country who are doing incredibly tough jobs, and they're professional, they're hardworking, they're making an important contribution to all of our lives every single day. And I want to pay tribute to them, because when we get into the debate about policing culture and some of the challenges facing policing, I don't want that to be a criticism of the hardworking professional officers that anybody can meet all day, every day out on the streets and elsewhere working on our behalf. So tribute to them. But there are some major challenges, and if you talk to police officers at the front line, they agree there are some major challenges. There are challenges to do with the culture, to do with technology, to do with the society and the way it's changing, and to do with public confidence in the policing. And I want to very briefly touch on those. So I'm just going to be a handful of slides, 5 minutes, and then of course people can start the debate, ask questions, and raise anything they wish. The first thing to say is that the nature of crime has changed since I was working in number 10 20 years ago. At that time, the main crimes, the big volume crimes, as we called them, were burglary, car crime, and robbery. If you look at the next slide, Margot, please, you'll see that now 40% plus of all crime is fraud, most of it, or almost all of it, online. And sometimes online crime gets kind of dismissed as a victimless crime, but actually these are people losing their pensions, their savings. It's a devastating crime. And you can see that traditional bobbies on the beat aren't the answer to this big change in crime. So that's a big change over 20 years. The pattern of crime has changed in relation to violent crime. That rose significantly between 2015 and 2021. Kit will point out that there's been progress on that in the last year or so, and that's important and good. And the government's uplift, the 20,000 extra police officers, are very welcome, and they're an important contribution, but they can't solve all the crimes that we face because the nature of crime is changing dramatically. The other thing to say about policing currently is that the police are often distracted by effectively social problems. If I could have the next slide, Margot, please. So here's the big rise over a 6-year period in the number of missing persons incidents affecting the police. The police, obviously, if a missing person is reported, the police have no choice and wouldn't even think about not following that up. But it's interesting that they spend 3 million investigation hours every year following up missing persons. That's enough to pay for all the police officers in North Yorkshire. And I don't think when people are paying the police precept, wherever they are in the country, Surrey or anywhere else, they think that that's the main thing they're paying for. The police always follow up, but what we need in that case is the original social services, often care homes for teenagers, to do the job better in the first place and to prevent the person going missing. The next slide, Margot, shows the same thing. There's been a big rise in the number of mental health incidents that police are called to. I spent some time on the front line with police officers in Warwickshire, the West Midlands, and South Wales and Gwent. And I went with one pair of police officers to a mental health incident. It was a young man who clearly had major mental health challenges. They resolved it. They prevented violence inside a household. But as they left, they were saying, we'll be back in a short space of time because nobody will solve the underlying problem. And the police officers are very responsible people. They're the social service of last resort, and this is distracting them from the task that I think the vast majority of the public want them to do, which is preventing crime and detecting crime. Next slide, please. And partly as a result of the austerity, when the number of police officers fell dramatically, now being addressed by Kit Malthouse and his colleagues in a very welcome way, partly because of these distractions that the police are facing that I've just talked about, detection rates are very significantly down, and you see that on this graph here. And the percentage of crimes being detected is now below 10%. That can't be anything close to ideal, and it affects confidence in policing because police are unable to do the basics, as revealed in this graph. They're not.
Although Kit will doubtless point out that his appointment as policing minister coincides with the line changing direction sharply.
Yes, well, yes, and Kit and I have talked about it, and it's encouraging to see that. And I think that the growth in number of police officers, some of these things will be affected. If we move on to the next graph, you'll see that public confidence fell in line with that failure to charge and some of the other things, the lack of visibility as community policing retreated, the lack of detection I've just revealed, and so on. And it fell particularly on the next graph in the Met, which you see. You can move the graph on, Margot. You see it's fallen most steeply in the Met, and Kit can claim that it fell after he left as well. So his credit will be up, but the problem is significant, and that's partly a result of the various scandals and really serious incidents that have been reported in the last 6 months. But it's also a sense among the public that the basics aren't being done as they need to be done. And so confidence is falling. And that's a serious problem because policing by consent right back to the beginning, 1829, the Metropolitan Police Act, has been based on policing by consent. And policing by consent depends on the quality of the relationship between the public and the police. And if public confidence is falling, that can't be good news. And that's why I think there is a crisis of confidence in policing. And the next Met Commando will be an important part of addressing that, as will the leaders of the other 42 police forces in the country, as of course will what the government does. And there are 3 capacity challenges on the last slide, 3 challenges facing the police. I've mentioned that. So next slide, Margaret, thank you. There's a capacity challenge. There aren't enough police. They haven't got the best technology. Those things are being addressed. The new spending review will help address that. The 20,000 uplift will help address that. There's a capability challenge. If you talk to any police officers, police learning, police training, police career development is not what it needs to be, and that needs to be addressed. And that's part of changing the culture in a positive way. And finally, there's an organisational challenge. And particularly, and I'm glad to say that the Home Secretary and Kit have been doing this, strengthening the centre, because while we want the 43 police forces to be able to effectively tackle local crime, some of these things like fraud, like international crime, like serious and organised crime, need to be addressed strategically from the centre, and that is now being addressed. So there are big challenges of capacity, capability and organisation. And if we get those three things right over the next few years, then we can address the crisis in public confidence.
Thank you very much, Sir Michael. And in the introduction, I should have said, obviously, that Sir Michael is one of the most experienced experts in public sector delivery, having worked for Tony Blair and set up his delivery unit, and having recently done the same for Boris Johnson. Let's go now to Lisa. Who as a PCC is overseeing, helping to confront these problems, or if you share the diagnosis, is helping to confront these problems on the ground.
Yeah, I think Sir Michael raises some really interesting issues, and as Police and Crime Commissioner in Surrey, and I was elected in May, so I'm less than a year into my term, but I certainly recognise a lot of the challenges that have been raised in this review, but also I think more generally. And I think it is really interesting, and you said at the beginning, Robert, that we're having this conversation at what is a very topical conversation at a really interesting time, and I think that a lot of the time these conversations that we're having around policing, and I'm sure a lot of the conversations that Kit's having at Cabinet and elsewhere, are conversations that would have largely been had actually in private, and would have gone quite under the radar. And even where we were having them in public, they probably weren't terribly well attended and nobody was that interested. And I think public interest in policing is really, really high at the moment. And I think it is for a lot of the reasons that Sir Michael set out. And it is around public confidence, and it is around how we feel about policing by consent and a lot of these issues. And Surrey, certainly the lovely leafy county that we're always called, is not immune to any of these things. I also think it's really interesting that we are talking about policing and a lot of the challenges that we're facing, which are very, very public at the moment, at a time when policing is moving into much more of the private realm, actually. And it used to, of course, always be the case that the policing was done and the police were seen as being there to very much to police our public space, whether that was our towns and city centres, our rural areas, but very much sort of in the outside and in public. And we saw them, whether that was public order and other things. And increasingly, of course, we're seeing policing coming into our private spaces. Now, some of those private spaces are things like Twitter, which are still quite public, but also private spaces and looking at domestic abuse, looking at a lot of those crimes that happen behind closed doors. Now, I think that's a very, very good thing. And I think it is a good thing that police are doing that. And I also think it's a good thing that we're talking about it in public. And as PCC in Surrey, championing prevention work around VAUG, violence against women and girls, is something that's incredibly important to me, and I think it's a good thing, again, and something else I think is very good we're talking about. But Sir Michael also mentioned something that is very much happens in the private realm, and that is fraud. And in Surrey, again, we're not immune to this. We have a lot of very wealthy people living in Surrey, and they are not at all immune to being targeted by those criminals who, whether it's around cyber fraud. Romance fraud is a really big issue in Surrey as well. That's where people are sort of targeted by people claiming to be somebody that they're not, claiming to be somebody that's interested in them romantically, and then, as Sir Michael said, often pensions and other things are unfortunately the target. And I don't believe there's any such thing as a victimless crime. I believe all crimes have a victim somewhere. But again, these are things that are happening very much in public space. And what I find really interesting is everywhere I go, whether it's a parish council, whether it's a residents meeting, when I'm speaking to councillors and MPs right across Surrey, the one thing that comes up over and over again is visible policing. And that's something that the Minister will be hearing about all the time from colleagues as well, and I'm sure from constituents in his own patch in Hampshire. And it is really, really important. But I do think that we do have to have a very honest conversation with the public about what we mean about visible policing. And again, Sir Michael's referenced this, but the Bobby on the beat isn't necessarily going to be the answer to a lot of the current types of crime that we're facing, unfortunately. And I do say to people when I speak to them, and I do get asked the question an awful lot in meetings, in parish council meetings and others, why don't we see more police on our streets? And the truth is, I say to a lot of the residents in Surrey, if the most vulnerable in our society are not necessarily the ones that are helped most by a Bobby on the beat. You think about your 9-year-old granddaughter who's up in her bedroom looking at her mobile phone. Do you have any idea what she's looking at? Would you know how to look at it, even if you could get hold of the device? Or you think about your elderly grandmother who's sitting at home, who lives on her own, own, has been on her own an awful lot, particularly following COVID. Do you know who's contacting her on her landline? Do you know who's able to get at her through her, through her computer screen? And all of those things require a very different kind of policing. And I am a huge fan of Bobby's on the Beat. I want to see more visible policing, but I think we need to make sure that we've got a police force, and we need to make sure that we've got police officers who are every bit as comfortable on the digital beat as they are on the physical beat. And that's something in Surrey that we're working really hard at making sure that we've got. So I really welcome the CPS hosting this conversation. I'm a long-time admirer and supporter of the CPS, and I look forward to having a really interesting conversation this afternoon.
Thanks so much. And now to the man himself, Kit Malthouse.
Well, Robert, thanks very much indeed, and thanks for having me. What I hope will be an interesting discussion. I'm conscious that we want to open the floor up to people, so I'll be quick. I think, obviously, talking to Michael over the last few months about his review and getting a sense of direction, it does come at a very opportune moment to think about what the next stage of policing should look like. Because when you look at the long-term crime mission, it's worth appreciating the context, which is that even according to the British Crime Survey, current levels of crime are significantly below where they were in the late 1990s, early 2000s, even including new crimes like fraud and cyber. So in the long term, under governments of all stripes, the fight against crime has been pretty much a resounding success. But the issue is not necessarily that we could call it a success, but that we're in a less worse situation, and that there's a moral imperative for us to try and drive even further improvement. And as Michael said, we've been through a sort of tumultuous phase the last few months, last year or so, with policing, some of it driven by COVID, some of it driven by internal scandal and cultural problems which need to be addressed, which does mean it's a good time for us to think about the future of policing. And it's definitely on the agenda from a media public consciousness point of view. But there's one question which I think both Michael and Lisa referred to, which I think we need to answer for, which is, what is the future of policing not about? Because over the last 10, 15, 20 years, certainly in my time in policing, we have laid an awful lot of society's problems at the feet of the police. As Michael pointed out, are the police supposed to be first responders to mental health incidents, which is absorbing a huge amount of response officers' times, as Michael pointed out. But when you talk to frontline cops, that was what they will say. Certainly over the last 10 years of my involvement in policing, that has been the big rise in capacity occupation. Are the police responsible for relationship breakdown, as Lisa said, beyond the front door, the nature of relationships? And are they responsible for community cohesion where there is tension? Are the police responsible? They've often assumed responsibility for the demand side of the drugs equation rather than just the supply, that prevention work. Should the police be an arm of trading standards for the sale of illegal goods online and elsewhere? And in particular, in the big growth area that Michael pointed to on fraud and cyber, what realistically do we think the police should be doing, as opposed to the public sector or indeed the private sector as a whole, from a prevention point of view? And of course, the great parallel to that, the great success over the last 20 years has been car crime. Some of you on this call, I'm certainly old enough to remember, do you remember those car radios, stereos used to remove from the car, or the ones that had a front on them? This was the industry struggling with the technology to try and bring in prevention. The creation of the immobilizer means that car theft fell significantly. And in a situation where we see nearly 50% of thefts from vehicles because people leave the car open, or indeed nearly 50% of burglaries because people leave a door or a window open, what is the role of the wider prevention apparatus in society to assist the police as they look to the future? So I think that's a question we have to ask. What realistically do we want the police to be doing? What is their future not about? And if there are problems that should be solved, well, undoubtedly mental health is one. Who should be doing that, and who is best equipped to do that, I think is the key thing. And the police, I think, talking to them, would say that other public sector organizations and indeed private sector stepping up to the mark would make an enormous difference, not least in the online space, where they seem to be able to work out quite smartly what I want to buy and advertise it to me. But oddly, they don't seem to be able to work out when someone's trying to scam me, or someone is streaming child abuse, or all these other horrors that happen online, and get ahead of that prevention. Now, the government's doing work with them. Obviously, the online harms bill will help with some of that stuff. But these are the questions we have to ask. And then I think for the future, I think there are three, and I like Michael's three priorities, and I sort of agreed with them with some variation. The first one I think we need, that the police deserve, is a clear and prioritized mission. We often, I think, are guilty of asking them to do everything all the time, everywhere, rather than saying, here are the clear priorities that we want you to brigade yourself to deal with. Now, we've tried to do that in our Beating Crime Plan. We've given some clear priorities around neighborhood crime and violence as a first order of business that we want sorted out. And amongst that, as I hope you will all have seen, there is a big chapter in there called Excellence in the Basics. We do agree that there are basic requirements that the British people want from their police force that need to be fulfilled. A sense, as Lisa said, of governed space in the public realm, that if they have a burglary, they will be visited, there will be an investigation, that they are going to be safe from violence when they head out into the public realm, that their children will make it home in one piece, that the phone will be answered in a timely fashion, and they will get information about their inquiries ongoing. All these basics need to be fulfilled if that fundamental promise, that contract is going to be reinforced. But we, I think, as a governing class, if you like, as the people who set the what rather than the how, and that includes police and crime commissioners, need to make sure we have a simple mission that is prioritized, that allows the police to brigade themselves for success. The second area, I think, where we need to think carefully about the future is leadership and professionalism. We can put in place all the culture, all the processes we like to deal with some of the cultural issues that have been thrown up by events over the last year or so. We can look at vetting, we can look at social media examination, we can look at internal disciplinary structures and all the rest of it. But unless you get the leadership right, and therefore the culture right, all of it will be fighting with one hand behind its back. And alongside that comes professionalism. To some controversy, we've tried to improve professionalism in policing, bringing in the idea of police officers joining and then acquiring a degree level qualification, that there is an idea of ongoing training and professional development for the police throughout their career that we hope will lead to a greater sense of professionalism, but also focusing right throughout the whole range of ranks. Very often when we talk about leadership, we talk about the command course upwards. So that's commander and upwards, which is the very senior echelons of policing. But actually, for my part, the most important rank in any police force is sergeant. That is the basic foundation of leadership. That is your frontline commander. That is you can get to lead to sergeant quite quickly, 3 to 5 years. And you can therefore have a big impact on culture and process and professionalism and effect at the level of sergeant. And so working with the College of Policing, I think over the next few years, that's very much where we'd like to concentrate. And then the third area is about the police's acquisition and use of technology. I'm a great believer that there is enormous potential in crime prevention, never mind detection, in the acquisition of technology. But like all areas of the public sector, the police have not been very good at acquiring technology in a coherent way and at scale. There's a lot of work going on across UK policing. A lot of it is driven by individual enthusiasms, by officers or police and crime commissioners for particular projects or particular bits of kit. We want to bring some coherence to that. And so the centre reinforcing the idea that technology should have a big role, but that we want a coherent and consistent approach to that acquisition is key. We now have a scientific advisor. We've got a group centralizing that work. You know, the use of AI for crime prediction and detection, the use of live facial recognition, which we think holds out enormous potential, the development of forensic science and biometrics for the future, and then the better acquisition of data analysis and the better skilling up of our data analysis capability for the prediction of crime, we do think holds out enormous potential to drive these numbers down even further. But critical to that, critical to any innovation, is allowing failure. Right, is allowing the police to experiment, and for sometimes projects not to work out they may otherwise have done. It doesn't mean you don't learn something from it, doesn't mean it's not worth a try, but allowing them to use technology in a way, in a safe space, I think will help build resilience for the future. So I'm very conscious that conversations about the future of policing are very often about structure. But I think actually we need to think in this overall context of massive falls in crime over the last 30 or 40 years, we need to now think about mission, leadership, technology to drive us to the next stage, as well as saying, what is the thicket, the swarm of wasps around a police officer's head that we need to move aside for others to deal with so that they can see that mission clearly and drive for a better future.
Thank you so much, Kit. We'll now move towards a discussion. I'll ask a few questions, but the questions are already stacking up in the Q&A, so I'll try to throw it to the audience as soon as possible. As I said to our panelists before we started, please don't feel you need to answer every question. Just chip in if it's particularly germane to you. But I wanted to start with the sort of the issue of confidence, which Sir Michael identified. As Kit said, crime has gone down, in the aggregate. So why is it that confidence has fallen? Is this a generalised issue, or is this about particular areas or communities? We saw with the Met. I'll just throw in something here. I mean, I took a leave of absence from the CPS to help write the Tory manifesto in 2019, and one of the reasons it had, we will hire more police officers front and centre, was there seemed to be a sense from people that just that the quality of the public space was getting worse around them. But then there's obviously a clash between that and the fact that crime is increasingly moving online. So what are the drivers of that confidence issue, and how do we address them?
I think a lot of it, Rob, is around communication, if I'm completely honest. I mean, I think we're very good now at talking about all the problems. We're not always necessarily terribly good at talking about some of the solutions, some of the great work. And I do think that, as a bit of, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think that's where PCCs on the ground can be a really, really useful tool actually for police forces. And I spend my time, and I know my colleagues around the country do as well, getting out, talking to residents about the really good stuff, and also feeding back. Having that opportunity to speak to residents in their own communities and feeding back to the police what the issues are, and then explaining actually what we're doing, I think is a really powerful tool.
Robert, can I comment on that?
Please.
Yeah. So, first of all, I strongly endorse the remarks of Lisa and Kit preceding this. I do think it's important to rebuild confidence. I do think the loss of confidence is a major issue. I do think policing by consent, which is a long and honourable British tradition and admired around the world, is really important. And so we do need to address it. And I think it's partly about vigorously tackling the various scandalous things we've heard about in the last few months, which I don't want to go into particularly, and the way in which leadership that Kit emphasised tackles those issues, precedent, successor and others. That is really important. But I also think it's about, and again, Kit emphasised this, and Lisa, doing the basics right. So making sure that policing is visible in communities, making sure that PCCs, which they are doing, get out there. That's why I think they've been a very successful innovation over the last decade. All of that is important. And then detecting crimes more effectively. We've got a big shortage of detectives. Digital forensics are too slow. So there are big challenges just in getting the basics to work in the way you'd want to. And then on the wider issues where Kit made a very important point about what policing should not be about. And for that, we need much stronger partnerships between policing, social services, education, health, and indeed the CPS within the criminal justice system.
The other CPS.
Yes.
Sorry, we were there first, by the way, if I could just.
Crown Prosecution Service. Yes, and then also again, my colleagues have, on the panel have mentioned this, but strengthening prevention, so avoiding crime in the way that has happened. Kit gave the example of car crime, but it's also happened with burglary. It needs to happen with financial services, tech companies in relation to fraud now. So I think all of that is good. And I think if we get the basics right and tackle vigorously these scandals, the confidence can be addressed, and that will be very important for the future of policing.
So I think Michael and Lisa did right. So Michael in particular, I'm old enough to remember when the confidence measure was brought in for policing. If you remember, it used to be a measure, and there was a huge amount of academic research gone into how could you move the confidence measure, what could you do, was it about, you know, leaflets, was it all the rest? In the end, it came down to just doing a bloody good job.
Yeah.
Right, and that the confidence would follow. There was always going to be a lag. But if you, as Michael said, if you got the basics absolutely right, then sooner or later you would win through on confidence. Now, you have to overlay that with exactly, as he said, the vigorous dealing with some of these internal scandals, but also recognizing that, as Michael quite rightly said at the start, there are thousands and thousands of police officers who you don't hear about every single day doing lots of great things. But you do, that does percolate through, and while everybody has a story from a friend or a relative about how you know, they've had perhaps a poor interaction with the police, or we never see a cop round here, or we've never had anybody on our street. If you do a good job, if you visit every burglary, if you drive things, you know, street robbery down, if you clear people out on antisocial behavior in the local park, in the end, people start to recognize that you've done a good job. It might take time, but sooner or later they think, oh, actually, do you know what? We haven't had a burglary for a long time. Things are in good shape. We have seen a police officer in the high street, and you win on confidence. So I think that we're wrong. We are right to be concerned about confidence, but we are wrong to concentrate on it rather than just saying, well, it will follow if we do a bloody good job. So let's get crime down. Let's not talk about process and PR. Let's talk about crime and focus on that clear mission and get the numbers down, and the rest will follow.
Thanks. Okay, I think that's very, that makes all the sense in the world. The next question I wanted to ask, I mean, and it's sort of cropped up a bit in the conversation, but the you know, we have 43 police forces in, all doing their separate things. Yet, as you've all been saying, the new crimes are the online and fraud crimes. These are much less amenable to traditional boundaries than before. Do the sort of current structures still make sense? I mean, does the traditional model still make sense, or is it a case that you need to pull either have strengthen links between the centre and the forces, or split responsibilities in a different way?
Shall I say something about that? Start with that. So I definitely think we need to give some thought to how we acquire the right capability, whether that is held in the office of constable or held elsewhere. And secondly, where that should be located. So, for example, you will know, Robert, people on this call will know that there is some, high-level capability that British policing has that is held at the National Crime Agency, and it's held centrally because it's not sensible for every force to have that capability because they don't necessarily need it, and reproducing it 41 times in England and Wales would be crazy. So there definitely needs to be a discussion about how that sits. And where it sits. The other discussion is about who's doing it in government. So, for example, there is quite a lot of effort goes into fraud at the Treasury, right? So HMRC are quite a big player in the fraud and economic crime area. So are the NCA. Every police force has its own fraud and cyber unit. We've got lots of organizations that are playing in the field, and we've got the Cyber Security Centre. We've obviously got UKIC and GCHQ. I think Ben Wallace has been successful in getting quite a lot of money for a cyber warfare unit up in the north, which will have a big impact. Now, in the Venn diagram of offending online, all of these things cross over. And so the question is where is the coherent home for it, and what is a coherent structure? And I think that's a live discussion at the moment.
Thanks. Do either of the other panelists want to chip in, or we can?
I'll comment. If Lisa wants to go, I'll comment after Lisa.
No, I think there are some. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. What I would say is I would be very nervous of moving too far away from local. Certainly, residents appreciate local policing. They want to know that there is a Surrey police officer there when they need somebody. I don't think that, and both Sir Michael and Kit have mentioned the importance, as we all know, about visible policing and bobbies on the beat. And I think that certainly in Surrey, where extra officers are helping us get back to officers who really, really know their patch, they know the roads, they know the families, you know, they will go around doing an enormous amount of preventative work by making sure they're knocking on doors, visiting people who are vulnerable, visiting those families who perhaps have kids who are a little bit more troublesome than others. So I would hate for us to move away from that localised policing, but I think that there is absolutely strength in numbers in some areas. And a classic example for us in Surrey is, you know, we work very closely and collaboratively with Sussex Police on a lot of areas, you know, major crime being one of them, and roads policing and other ops areas. So I think it's about finding the right balance where we're giving the right thing to residents, but we're also doing everything that we can with the best capability and technology possible to make sure that we're tackling those serious national issues. And as you say, you know, cyber and fraud is huge, because it means that you can commit a crime from anywhere in the world that targets anywhere in the world, and we have to be very alive to that and not naive about it.
Thank you. So we've got 23 questions just on the Q&A, and more coming in. So I'm going to try and rattle through them and B, sort of combine topics as much as I can. But I guess we have to start with the first question we were asked from Remus Big, which is, what do you think of the IOPC report earlier this month? Is this culture in the Met deep-rooted and historical? Why does this culture exist? I mean, we saw the chart about confidence in the Met. I mean, the statistic I throw in here is that from the CRED report recently, and the Commission on Racial Equality and Disparities, that, you know, the homicide rate for young black males was 24 times the homicide rate for young white males, and you know, most of the black people in the UK, you know, a very large proportion of the black people in the UK are based in London. I mean, is that, you know, what's gone wrong basically?
Can I comment on the previous question briefly? I strongly support what Lisa said about local crime and responsiveness and the 43 police forces. We didn't want to go into should we have 15 police forces or 10 police forces and do away with 43. We like having looked at the police and crime commissioner role. We think local police forces dealing with local crime and being responsive is very important. We looked at the pattern of crime and how to address it in a significant way, and that means at the same time as you strengthen local policing, you also want to strengthen the centre and some regional functions, and our report will go into that. But on the point you're making about the confidence in the Met, it is partly about these so-called scandals. It's partly about the need to deal with them in a public, visible way, so that they're clearly being tackled and not swept under the carpet, which is a bit harsh, but there's an element of that in what's happened. And it's also about getting the responsiveness, and in London it's a huge police force, so getting the basic command units to deal effectively and fairly with local policing issues, and building the changing nature of the police force itself. We've got welcome growth in the number of women police officers. We've got a welcome growth in the number of ethnic minority police officers, including from the African Caribbean community, but it's not fast enough, and we need to accelerate that. And then we do need to make sure that powers such as stop and search, which are very useful powers to the police, are used in an evidently fair way and not in a way that looks really quite disturbing when you see the statistics.
Yeah, so look, from my point of view, obviously the events at Charing Cross Police Station were horrendous, and whether they point to a wider issue will come out of Louise Casey's work. As you know, she's been engaged to have a look at Met culture. We've also got the inspectorate, well, the Angelini review that's looking at the issues around the Wayne Couzens and who killed Sarah Everard in that appalling crime, how he became to be a Met police officer, and then whether there are wide issues as well. So there will be conclusions to be drawn from that. But in any large organization, as I say, you're going to get these cultural issues. The question from time to time, the question is whether there is enough of a structure and an internal culture of calling that out and being able to call that kind of behavior out safely that gives people confidence that if and when it does bubble up, it's dealt with swiftly and stamped on. Because you're right, these incidents, even if it is isolated, and as I say, those inquiries will conclude whether it is or it isn't, even if it is isolated, it still has a massive impact on people's perception of the Met, because we all consume it as if it were local to us. The media has a way of conflating these things. On your second point, usefully sometimes, but a way of conflating these things. On your second point, I'm very, in many ways, tragic though it is, I'm very pleased you asked me that, Robert, because I often get challenged on disproportionality on stop and search. But I've yet to be challenged on the disproportionality of victims of knife crime, particularly in London. And it is deeply, deeply alarming. Back in 2008, when I was Deputy Mayor for Policing, we had a similar spike in knife crime, and it was similarly skewed, sadly, towards young black men who were being killed in ever-increasing numbers. And we took strong assertive action to turn that around, which we successfully did over the ensuing 3 or 4 years. But it's challenging and difficult, and it can only be done if you recognize that disproportionality, if you recognize this awful statistic that a significant number, the vast majority of the 30 who were killed in December last year were BME young males. And it's only if you acknowledge that issue that you can start to get behind the causes and do the really important work you need to do, confrontational, difficult though it may be, to save their lives.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions from the media, if you've infiltrated the Q&A. Mark Easton, who I'm assuming is Mark Easton from the BBC. If police don't look for missing persons or deal with mental health crises or do preventative work around drugs and alcohol, who will? Have cuts to social services been the problem?
So I don't think it's necessarily the case, sorry to come in first, that the police shouldn't do missing persons. They absolutely should. The question is what then happens, right? So for example, if you talk to response police officers, they will say they'll come on shift, they'll get a call to do a mental health MISPA, they'll find the person, then they'll spend the rest of the shift sitting in casualty, waiting for them to be admitted or for a bed to be found. So they're doing basic guarding in the hospital. Now, even if the capacity eventually comes on stream, whether they should be doing that basic guarding function, which I hesitate to say, but it absorbs a huge amount of response time. You'll find a lot of police officers sitting in admissions in hospital, waiting just to hand somebody over. These are the kind of seemingly small individual items, but when you add them all up, makes a big difference on capacity. Now, there are some areas of innovation. So Humberside Police, for example, have done some very strong work with their local mental health trust and their local CCGs to talk about this issue. And as a result, they've reached an understanding and a modus operandi which has seen, I think, a 25 to 30% drop in capacity demands on the police, right? So it is possible to do. The question is, can you galvanize the whole public sector to recognize that while the police definitely have a job to do as first responder, dealing with the consequence thereafter of that response may need closer working from other parts of the public sector.
Yeah, and I think that's where PCCs really should be working very, very hard across partnerships to bring together. I mean, to give you an idea, in Surrey, about a third of our demand in Surrey is mental health. We do 42 mental health cases a day, Surrey Police, and this is a relatively small force, and 7 missing persons cases every day. And as Kit says, it's the time that takes officers. And I work very closely right across with partners, mental health partners and others right across, because police will always turn up, and we know that the police will always turn up. Where an ambulance service may feel they're not required, where a hospital may feel they're not required, or somebody else says that's not really up to us, they know the police always will, and that's something that needs to change.
I just want to reinforce that, and to go to Mark's question, I'm certainly not arguing that the police shouldn't follow up missing persons. They should and they have to, and they always will, because they feel the responsibility that Lisa has just talked about. But we do need to social services where they're appropriate, mental health trusts where they're appropriate, to do the job of preventing people going missing better.
Exactly.
Picking them up when they're found. I talked to 2 police officers in the Midlands who had gone to find a missing 16-year-old boy found him, taken him back to the care home, and the care home and said, actually, he's meant to be with his parents tomorrow. Would you mind taking him there? His parents lived over 100 miles away and the police drove him there. That's 2 officers' time for all that drive. That's not what we expect the police to do. So that there is a social care and a mental health trust issue, and they need to do that. And that's what I'm talking about with real practical partnerships. So the police will always be the last resort, but that needs to be less often because the other services are doing a better job.
And to be fair, just to say, in one particular area, we are recognizing that. So the PCSC bill, which is coming back to the Commons on Monday, does have this serious violence duty in there, which for the first time places a statutory duty on other public sector organizations, health, local authorities, to come alongside the police to try and prevent serious violence in any community. Now, this is a recognition of the fact that you need a kind of coalition of the willing in every geography to prevent these issues. The police will always have to deal with the consequences, but prevention is much better than cure.
And Kit, if you'll stay on the line, David Barrett of the Mail has a question for you, which is, you noted that the office of constable may not be the future of all crime fighting. Do you see more responsibilities being passed to specialist civilian investigators, such as those with IT skills? And how would that affect overall police staffing levels?
Well, I do think, yes, as we look to dealing with some of these cyber crimes, in particular online crime, but others, that the use of other expertise, or particularly focused expertise beyond the generalized expertise and capability of constable, will be helpful. And that's the truth already, right? So we've got, whether it's forensic accountants at the National Crime Agency or programmers sitting in West Midlands Police doing data analytics around crime prevention. These are all skills that the police need to acquire. From my point of view, I obviously want to get the officer count up to the target that we've set of 20,000 extras, which I think in theory should be the highest number the country's ever had, and then maintain that number. But alongside that, police staff and in other organizations bringing complementary skills that enable the police to do the job in new areas enabled by technology, I think will be critical to success. As you would expect, right? I mean, that's, as I say, that happens already. We just need more.
In our final report, we'll build on what Kit has just said and set out different proposals for the future of the policing career, the police learning and training and development, which definitely needs to improve, the quality of leadership that Kit has emphasised, and this need for new skills in these new areas, which clearly the traditional Bobby on the beat, important though he or she is, cannot do currently. So we need these other skills to be brought in on top of the 140-something thousand police officers will be when Kit hits his 20,000 target.
On a related note, I mean, we've had a few questions on the issue of police leadership and how you build that, and how you empower when we talked about the question of capacity earlier, how you ensure that you have the best people doing the best job. Any thoughts on that to amplify what you've already said?
I'll comment first, and then Lisa may well have the task of influencing. Well, does have the task of influencing police leadership, and I'd be very interested in her views. But I think we need leaders who are able to engage the public in the police alongside their PCCs, and who can tackle these deep-rooted cultural issues when they arise in a more vigorous way. And the other thing I think we will want to talk about in our final report is carving out real investment in police leadership development from the sergeants that Kit mentioned all the way up, because when there are a period of spending cuts, as through the period of austerity, one of the things that goes is investment in leadership training and development, and that needs to be put right.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I think one of the things, I mean, I've been fortunate. I've had, my career has spanned both public and private sector. And I thought it was particularly interesting, actually, what Kit said earlier about, the ability to fail and having that safe space in which to fail, particularly when it comes to innovation and technology. And I spent 5 years working in finance, in particular in venture capital. And probably one of the things I took from there that I think is relevant wherever you go is fail fast. Have that, be given that permission to fail fast. And I think, and I've only been in post for 9 months and I don't have a background in policing, but one of the things that has struck me is how policing is absolutely changing. You know, there are very few things in any walks of life now where it's a career for life. And I think that in policing, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I would like to see, from a leadership point of view, more people coming into policing from perhaps other sectors, but also reaching out to other sectors, particularly the private sector, some areas of the private sector, and learning some of the leadership skills there. Because I think it's really only by seeing different leadership styles in different sectors that we can really learn. And I think that, you know, whether it's the College of Policing, whether it's the Police Foundation, Home Office, us as PCCs, absolutely have a duty to look at what is best in class, and not just best in class in policing or the public sector, but what are the best leadership skills, and what can policing and police leaders learn from those.
Well, I mean, we just had a question pop up as you were speaking, saying, should this involve the resurrection and expansion of the direct entry scheme?
Well, in theory, yes. I mean, look, many years ago, I can remember a member of police staff coming up to me with a wry smile and saying, "God, you know, it's amazing. Those 20 weeks at Hendon must be incredible training, because it means 30 years later you could be an IT director and a property director and an HR person, all that kind of stuff." Now, and it used to be the case that between, other than for specialist capabilities, between Hendon and the command course, there was no sort of professional development at all. Now, happily, that has changed. And I know the College of Policing in particular is having a new look at what it can do around leadership training for policing, because in my experience of 25 years now in the public sector, pretty much all problems come down to questions of leadership and capability, whether it's from a school or a GP surgery or a hospital or a police force. It's at the heart of everything. And so a strong investment and an emphasis on that it will be key. And the great news, of course, is this is a known science, right? It's not hard. There are large private sector organizations and indeed public sector ones who've harnessed this ability and recognize how to develop people through the organization. CPD is now becoming standard in many large organizations and bring them on. And we need to catch up with that. But as I say, given that policing is still, notwithstanding the changes recently, a kind of 30-year profession, and it's a command organization, looking at the rank of sergeant as the bedrock of the future of policing, I think is a critical first step. And if we can build the skills, capability, the idea that people should be investing in themselves and the organization should be investing in them at an early stage, then you build that internal culture of kind of excellence. In terms of direct entry, yeah, I mean, look, where we can acquire skills from externally, we should be doing. We've already got direct entry detectives now coming in through police now. I think last year or the year before, I attested the first 267 direct entry detectives coming through the police now route. So that there are these different avenues of access are developing, and certainly through the Uplift program, although it is skewed towards younger applicants, we are getting more mature people coming through with a variety of skills, and that's something to be encouraged. And as we move into the last year of the Uplift, if you like, we'll complete the 20,000 hopefully in the next 12 months, but then we've got to maintain that number, and that gives us the ability to look at the skills and diversity mix across the whole of policing on an ongoing basis, not just as part of this big upswing.
Can I just highlight something that Kit just mentioned about police now? 20 years ago, I was involved in the foundation of Teach First, which brought teachers from good universities, graduates from good universities into teaching, and provided a really good basis initially in London and then around the big cities. And many of those people now are leaders in the teaching profession of academies and so on. And I think if we get police now right and continue to build on it, many of the leaders of the future may well be coming in through that route. So I think that's been a really important development that looks quite modest in numbers at the moment, but will be very significant over the long run.
We're not going to have time to get to it, unfortunately, but there's a fascinating comment from Robert Beckley in the Q&A, if anyone can see it, whose two sons have just joined as new constables, and he says that he completely gets your point, Kit, but they rarely see a sergeant, let alone an inspector, and that there's a fascinating sort of issue about how you combine efficiency with development and ownership of crimes.
Well, just to say, Robert, we are monitoring the new entrants extremely closely by survey, And, happily, the vast majority of them are saying they're having a lovely time and it's fulfilling their expectations. But there is a lower proportion that are saying they're getting the kind of senior contact input that they want to see. And we're looking at it force by force basis and say, come on, now you need to start investing in these people and making them feel like you're bringing them on. So we're looking specifically at that issue.
A couple of questions. So basically, we're talking about the police. Should we be talking about the Crown Prosecution Service as the root of quite a lot of the problems in confidence? In particular, someone asks on low rates of rape conviction.
Lisa, do you want to comment?
I'm happy to say something about that. I mean, so I until recently had responsibility for that area of work. It now sits with Victoria Atkins at the MOJ. Look, I don't think it's about one particular part of the machine on rape and serious sexual offences. It's pretty obvious that the whole machine had effectively let everybody down. And, I stood up in the House and apologised for that and for the very low numbers of convictions. We are now putting in place a much more, what we call Operation Soteria, collaborative approach, because in truth, if these two critical organizations just sit back and fire pot shots at each other, we'll never make any progress. They need to collaborate on investigations. They need to shift the culture towards an investigation of the suspect rather than of the victim, and make sure that they have a sort of coherent sense of the mission in each and every investigation. Now, happily, in the 5 forces that we've started that project in, soon to be expanded, it's looking hopeful, and the early signs are good. But I think we are wrong to single out one part of the machine as being particularly to blame for a problem. It is a machine. It is a conveyor that has to work together. There are things that can be done to ease. There are particular blockages where they could work together to sort them out. One of the ones particularly, for example, that's concerning me at the moment is around the disclosure guidelines that have been put out by the Attorney General's office, which are having a big impact on police capacity. Talking to the AG's office, Solicitor General is now having a look, been around touring police forces saying, okay, what impact is this having? What can we do to try and sort this out and reach a better compromise that allows us to get what we both need? So I'm hesitant in this machine to point the finger. Similarly, for example, on legal aid, right? We're in conversation at the moment about trying to get legal aid coverage for legal advice to attend at the police station. Because we know if that happens, we're more likely to get an early guilty plea, which saves lots of money down the process in the system. Right? Might seem like a quite simple thing to do, but it takes a bit of work to get us there. So it's a system. We shouldn't pick out one particular part.
I mean, talking to ordinary police officers and people from the CPS, there has been traditionally a bit of a tendency for each to blame the other, and each needs to take responsibility, and we need to get that relationship working well. I'm glad to hear about the evidence you just brought to bear, Kit. Because I think what the public want is where there are offenders who are identified in as evidence, they should be charged and then prosecuted. And that needs to be a collaboration, and it hasn't been working nearly as well as it should, and it does need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think Kit highlights a couple of the very serious issues, one around disclosure, and that's absolutely true. And I think that it's going to be better working together because, as Sir Michael says, it sort of doesn't matter. We can all squabble at the top, but we need to sort of take a grip. And again, it comes back down to leadership. It really, really does, because the public don't care who the problem is with. They really, really don't. And us blaming the other side and then blaming us doesn't help the public. And I think that, as many PCCs, I chair I chair Surrey's Criminal Justice Board, and I do think that that they are forums for doing some really, really good work and collaborating. But we need to be better right across the board as leaders. We need to be better.
Yeah, I don't want just to say I don't want to have conversations anymore where the police say to the CPS, "Oh, you're not giving us enough early advice," and the CPS say, "Oh, well, your file quality isn't good enough." I would like a conversation where we all sit down and say, "How are we going to get the victim through to court? Make sure we get a conviction, please, together." Yeah. That's where it needs to be.
Yeah, and by the way, Kit, that conversation that you described, that the unhelpful one, was happening back in my time in Number 10 in the early 2000s, and so we really do need to move that culture on. And somebody once said to me about any big public service problem, the the first question to ask is not who's to blame, it's what should we do about it and how do we get it working?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I'm not sure we've ever had an event with the CBS with so many really good questions that we're not going to have time to get to. But I will ask our panelists just for one final contribution each, which is to in a single sentence, how optimistic are you about the challenges facing policing? I mean, you know, are we almost there? Is there a mountain to climb?
If you want I think there is a mountain to climb, but that we will climb it, and that depends on leadership and modernising the police so that they're a digital police force for the digital age rather than an analog police force for a digital age. But it can be done, and I think it will be done.
Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I remain incredibly optimistic about it. There absolutely is a mountain, but I meet brilliant, dedicated men and women every single day who are determined to deliver the best possible police service for the residents, you know, of Surrey and beyond. So I'm very, very confident that we will get there.
So I am very optimistic for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, we've got this big new shot of youth and energy going into UK policing, and you shouldn't underestimate the impact. As I say, we'll have by the end of it around 148,000 police officers. Of those, 45 odd thousand will have 3 years or fewer in terms of experience. They'll be new, which presents some organizational problems, but nevertheless is new energy, new people, a new look, a new feel, which is a bit of a refresh, which is great. And we're also at a pivotal point in terms of the kind of development into the 21st century of British policing. I know we're a few years into it, but nevertheless, policing is now definitely looking towards a new, more data technology enabled way of preventing and fighting crime, given that successfully over the last 30 years, they have driven crime down very significantly. And now they need to think about how they go to the next level. So yes, there's lots to be optimistic about, but it doesn't mean to say we haven't got some significant problems to overcome on the way.
Well, thank you very much to the Right Honourable Kit Malthouse, to Lisa Townsend, and to Sir Michael Barber. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your questions. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And please join us again for another a series of wonderful Centre for Policy Studies events that are coming up and will be in your inbox soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks,
Thank
Robert.
you.
Bye-bye. Bye.